So relief has come for many South Africans who've been stuck in other African countries since travel bans came into effect back in March. Government has continued with their repatriation efforts. Now, Gail and her partner were among some of those. Now, they cycled from Cape Town to Casablanca in Morocco, and not necessarily quite. We'll give you the full details in just a moment. Now, when they arrived at the Western Sahara border, they found out that the lockdown was in effect and they were stranded there. Thankfully, they're now back home in quarantine, though, at a hotel. Gail, as you can see, joins us now via our Skype line. Gail, thanks very much for making time. Welcome to the AM Report. As a start, give us an idea about what it feels like to be back home and the conditions that you're currently staying in.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful to be home, and it's fantastic to be in one of these wonderful, crisp, Gauteng mornings with the blue skies and the cool air. Our conditions are fantastic. We're staying at a very nice hotel, and we are fed 3 times a day. And they're looking after us very well indeed. So we're happy with that. I think government's doing a good job with the quarantines. I know there were some issues initially, but they seem to have resolved all of those.
That's fantastic news, especially as you've alluded, because of some of the recollections we've had about South Africans who've been repatriated elsewhere. We'll speak about that in just a moment, but I imagine many South Africans are asking about this cycle ride from Cape Town to Casablanca. Tell us a bit more about what that actually entailed and to what extent you actually knew about the coronavirus as you embarked on that journey.
So my partner Charles and I left Cape Town on the 1st of March 2019, and our goal was to cycle through all the West Coast countries up to Casablanca. We did not get to Casablanca because of COVID. The strange thing for us is that we were really disconnected in many ways from the world. We were staying in very localized accommodation, very often without a TV. Although we were connected, I suppose, on Wi-Fi quite often, we didn't really bother terribly much with the news. So we had heard a little bit that there was this virus in China, but one hears these stories and you don't really relate them directly to yourself. And it was only once we'd arrived in Morocco and passed through Western Sahara and were in the southern part of Morocco proper that we began to hear some of the stories. And for example, we met a couple who were traveling in Morocco in their camper van, and they told us that the ferries to Europe had been cancelled. And that was the first that we heard that there was, a potential problem that would impact us. And 2 or 3 days later, we went into lockdown. So it was kind of a shock to us. We really weren't expecting anything of that nature, and we found ourselves in Morocco for the next 2.5 months, really.
Wow. And at which stage of that discovery did you actually grapple with the prospect of being in that country, even whilst you don't necessarily want to stay there? At which stage did it dawn on you that you actually might be stuck in Morocco for the foreseeable future?
Look, for us, it wasn't as big a problem as it was for other people. We had retired at the end of 2018. We were on a long trip. We anticipated being away until at least the end of April. So we had the finances for that, and we were set up to cope with that. But as the lockdown went on, at first it was till the 20th of April, then it was extended till the 20th of May. And at that point, we began to think, when are we ever going to leave? Because the commercial flights were closed. Those are closed until 20th of July or so. And we began to worry that we might be there for 5 or 6 months, which was very different from a month or 2. And at that point, we really began to engage with the rest of the group in Morocco to see if we could get onto a repatriation flight.
Right, and obviously those engagements proved to be successful. Give us an idea of how easy that process was for you, because as you'd alluded earlier on, many South Africans stranded in other parts of the country particularly struggled with, for instance, reaching the embassies in their respective countries to get this process underway. How was your experience?
I think in Morocco we were very lucky. I have heard some nightmare stories about other embassies, for example, in the Philippines and so on. But certainly in Morocco, the embassy staff were available to us all of the time. They were there on WhatsApp through the weekends and into the evenings. They joined onto our group. There were a group of 34 South Africans stranded in Morocco. And the embassy staff joined that group. So when we were talking to each other, they understood our anxieties and concerns. For the people, I'm not sure what it was like for people in Mauritania and Ivory Coast and some of the other countries where we collected South Africans on the way home on our flight.
And take us through what your family might have been thinking during this entire process. I mean, obviously the lockdown was slowly closing in on South Africa as well, which would introduce all kinds of complexities with getting into the country. What were some of the salient concerns from some of your closest family members during this time?
I think our family were a little bit concerned that we might not have sufficient funds or access to our funds. And in fact, we did run into a bit of a problem where we lost contact with one of our banks and our phones weren't functional for a while. And we had to borrow some money from Charles' son-in-law. But we finally managed to resolve those issues. So money was, in general, for us, not a problem. But for some of the people I know in our group, for example, there was a young couple who had saved for 2 years to take a holiday in Morocco. And then they'd been there 3 days and they got locked down. And I know that their accommodation in Casablanca was something like 18,000 Rand a month. And they were there for over 2 months. They'd also recently bought a house in South Africa and had to deal with the costs here. So money, I think, was a major issue for many people. There were people I know overseas whose parents, for example, have died in South Africa while they've been away, and they've been unable to be at home with their families.
Sure.
So there are some very desperate and sad stories out there.
Yeah.
So we're all very glad to be home, and I would like to talk to you a little bit in a minute about how we got home and who brought us home, because I think that's an interesting part of the story.
Sure, go for it very quickly as we wrap up our interview. I mean, give us some of those details. How did you get to where you are?
Okay, so South African Airways and DIRCO, the Department of International Relations, have been doing a lot of work to bring home many hundreds of South Africans. But Africa seems to have been a particular challenge for them. And in the end, we in West Africa had to arrange a private charter through SEM Air. And SEM Air have been absolutely fantastic at rescuing stranded South Africans in Africa. So on our flight, for example, they had to fly, and it was quite a small plane that they brought to collect us, only a 100-seater Bombardier, apparently. They had to fly with 2 hops to get to Morocco. And then from Morocco, they picked us up in Casablanca. They picked people up in Nouakchott in Mauritania. They picked people up in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, in Abidjan in Ivory Coast, and in Pointe Noire in the Congo. And then had to do another fuel stop at Vic Falls before coming home. So we took off and landed 6 times on this trip. With a crew who were fantastic to us. The kinds of issues that one's not really aware of is you have to get permission from every country. Everybody's got complications on land. In Ouagadougou, they were doing repairs on the runway during the lockdown, and so we had to land and take off on this quite bumpy sort of runway. Food is a problem because none of the catering companies are open, and you're not allowed to load food, for example, in Casablanca. So they did their best. They gave us muffins and crisps and Coca-Cola, and we all brought papkos with us, having been forewarned and so on. But I really want to do a big shout out to SEM Air. They did a fantastic job in collaboration with DIRCO and with the embassies.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us into the picture so well. And I imagine, of course, many South Africans will share the sentiment with your family about being relieved that you're back home safely. So thanks once again for sharing your story with us. Gail Day is one of the South Africans who've been repatriated. She was in Morocco.